Greetings, comrades, friends, compatriots. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 15. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. A very interesting week that we are all going through following the US presidential elections. I've been having some conversations with African comrades, and one of them noted that how ironic it is that the United States, that Americans are actually now experiencing a little bit of how it feels to actually have a dictator as president of a country. And, one of them pointed out the irony that all these years, when the United States has been supporting dictatorial regimes in African countries, and the frustration that Africans feel as a result of that. And lo and behold, Americans can get a little bit of the sense of frustration when somebody who is supposed to be president of a country is just simply manifesting all the symptoms of a dictator. And in some other African countries, of course, it lasts for decades, like Mobutu in the Congo, the murder of Patrice Lumumba, sustained by the United States for 37 years in power. In Uganda today, General Museveni, sustained by the United States for 34 years in power. Imagine how Africans feel about that. So I just thought that was worth pointing out. But today we're here to discuss Kwame Nkrumah and his experience in Ghana. Now, Kwame Nkrumah is perhaps the leading global African hero of the 20th century. And he was considered that by many Africans in Africa and in the diaspora because of the unique time in history that Nkrumah emerged on the world stage. So he became a symbol of the possibilities in Africa, the repudiation and rejection of colonialism, and the dreams of African unity, the United States of Africa. And then globally in the African diaspora, including here in the United States, amongst African Americans, descendants of Africa, to see an African come into a position of power, first as prime minister in Ghana, when Ghana became the first British colony south of the Sahara to win independence in 1957, and then to become president when Ghana became a republic. That was a symbol of hope. It was a symbol of pride as well, in a country where descendants of Africa had historically been demonized and had been inculcated that Africans or descendants of Africa could not achieve. And to see somebody who looked like them, like Kwame Nkrumah, become prime minister and then president, that most certainly was also a great source of pride and joy. And one of the people who realized the possibilities very early and the prospects of what that might produce in terms of making a strong connection with Africa was Malcolm X here in the United States. But that came at a later stage, of course, in the 1960s. I would like to start Kwame Nkrumah's story from Ghana. So he was born in 1903 when it was still the Gold Coast, a British colony. He came to the United States for education in 1935. He went to Lincoln University, and that is a historically black college, Lincoln, and that's where he got his undergraduate degree as well as master's degree from Lincoln, as well as the University of Pennsylvania. But while he was here in the United States for 10 years, that was a period of a critical stage in his own political formation and outlook. During the summers, Nkrumah used to come to Harlem in New York, and he saw the black experience in this country, an experience that many Africans from the continent don't even understand or fully appreciate today in the 21st century. So by living in Harlem during the summer and interacting with African Americans, descendants of Africa, and experiencing some of the hardships that they also faced, experiencing discrimination and racism, Nkrumah was able to get a better understanding of the living experience of African Americans in this country. He was penniless, actually. And at one point, he was literally homeless in Harlem. And he ended up getting accommodation when one of his classmates from Lincoln ran into him in Harlem and introduced him to a Caribbean family that offered him a room and said, "It's fine. You don't have to pay until you get a job and you start earning some income." And he did many odd jobs. One of the jobs that he later wrote about in his autobiography was working in a soap factory. And it must have been a position of hard labor, because he writes that whenever he got back home, he would have to rub liniment, and that's a form of ointment, all over his body just to be able to sleep. So imagine he must have been doing a lot of heavy lifting. And later on, he became a member of the National Maritime Union. And after that, he was able to work on ships. But one of the most enlightening and educational experiences for Nkrumah in Harlem was attending many of those gatherings where you would hear nationalists, black nationalists, and Pan-Africans, the so-called soapbox orators. And I think by listening to them, he was also able to develop his own oratorical skills that he later put to good use when he returned to Ghana. At that time, obviously, we are talking about the post-Great Depression Harlem in the 1930s, when unemployment levels were still 15% in this country. And obviously, when unemployment is at a certain level in the African American community historically, it has always been double that of the general community or the European American community. So it means it could have been up to 30% or more for African Americans in Harlem. Harlem also was going through the post Marcus Garvey era. The teachings of Marcus Garvey remained still very popular as it is today. The whole issue of back to the motherland, Africa for Africans, Pan-African unity, all of the African communities around the world coming together as an international collective. Marcus Garvey himself had already been deported from the United States in 1927. He had been in Harlem from 1916. And then 1923 was when that case of alleged wire fraud was brought against him by the federal government. And most people, and I personally believe, his only crime was essentially inspiring the Pan-African spirit here in the United States. Garvey was attracting tens of thousands of people to his conferences. He presented a legitimate threat to the establishment in terms of what efficient, effective organizing could do in mobilizing African descendants here in the United States. So Garvey is out of the way, but Garvey's teaching is still very pervasive and very attractive to many followers. That was also the era when Mussolini, fascist Italy, invades Ethiopia in 1935. And that also was an incident that sparked a lot of outrage in the African diaspora community, including here in the United States. And Nkrumah was involved in that as well. And that gave him a sense of appreciation of how Africans from all societies, from the continent, from right here in the United States, and from the Caribbean, could mobilize and come together and work together on issues of common interest. And in that case, it was the campaign to mobilize outrage against the Italian aggression against Ethiopia, which at that time was also referred to as Abyssinia. There was a lot of pride in wanting to actually volunteer to go and fight to help defend Ethiopia against the Italian attack. And organizations sprung up here in the United States. People that were trying to volunteer to go to Ethiopia. But it remained mostly symbolic because the federal government was not going to allow descendants of Africa to go to Africa to help fight against imperial aggression. But it offered a great lesson to Nkrumah about the attractiveness and the power of Marcus Garvey's teaching. And he became a student of the teachings of Marcus Garvey. And of course, he was also a student of Lenin and a student of Marxism as well. So while here in the United States, Nkrumah also became very active in many organizations and became the Secretary General of the African Students Organization of the United States and Canada, and was able to make many connections with Africans he engaged with later on, after he had returned to Ghana. Then in 1945, Nkrumah leaves the United States and goes to London. Before he goes to London, he gets a letter of introduction written on his behalf by C.L.R. James. And many of you, of course, know C.L.R. James from his great book, the classic, The Black Jacobins. And C.L.R. writes to George Padmore, who is another great Pan-African intellectual, Marxist in London. And he says Nkrumah is a bit, rough, not that polished, but that he has great potential. And he urges Padmore to work closely with Kwame Nkrumah. So Nkrumah hooks up with George Padmore in London, and he becomes a student of Padmore and learns more about the theory, learns more about socialism and Marxism and organizing. Padmore was a master organizer. And while in London, Nkrumah becomes involved in a historic conference, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which perhaps was the most important of all the Congress in terms of African liberation. It was held in Manchester. Manchester was deemed to be the least racist of major British cities. And Nkrumah becomes one of the co-secretaries organizing that conference, together with one Jomo Kenyatta, who of course later on was to become prime minister and then president when Kenya won its independence from Britain in 1963. And at that conference was also Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, who later on was also to become a leader in Nigeria after independence. And also at that conference was W.E.B. Du Bois, who had attended the earlier conferences as well, one of the original organizers, together with people like Sylvester Williams, a Trinidadian, of the Pan-African Congresses. So you see these relatively young Africans interacting with African descendants from the United States and from the Caribbean, and mapping out an intellectual course of Africa's liberation at this conference in Manchester. Because this conference occurs at a unique time in history. It's after World War II. And the African intellectuals are saying Africans fought on behalf of empire. When they go back to Africa, they're not willing to go back to being fifth-class citizens. Nkrumah eventually is invited to return to Ghana in 1947 by one of the earliest political parties called the United Gold Coast Convention. It's a party that was founded and led by the Ghanaian elite, the bourgeoisie class in Ghana, relatively wealthy, educated, either in Ghana as well as in Britain. So the African elite in the British colony. And he becomes the Secretary General, organizing and agitating. But the party was not demanding for independence immediately. Its approach was gradualism, prepare us for independence. That was the demand. In 1948, there was an uprising when ex-servicemen in Ghana tried to deliver a petition to the colonial governor's palace. And after they were shot down, an uprising erupted. Nkrumah and other leaders of the United Gold Coast Convention were arrested and imprisoned. After he was released, Nkrumah realized that he needed to part ways with the United Gold Coast Convention, and he formed his own party, the Convention People's Party, CPP, which mobilized the younger Ghanaians, the much more militant Ghanaians. And the demand of his party was straightforward: independence now. Nkrumah eventually was arrested again in 1949, but his compatriots in the CPP kept agitating and organizing, and ultimately the British held an election where Africans were allowed to vote for the first time. And Nkrumah, even though in prison, won a seat in parliament. So he had to be released. And he became the chief minister, essentially a government that was in charge of domestic issues, but not in charge of defense and foreign affairs. And they kept agitating. Nkrumah organized what he calls positive action: strikes, boycotts, non-cooperation with the British colonial regime. Ultimately, Ghana won its independence, March 6, 1957, and Nkrumah became prime minister. And now he set about to realize some of the ideas he had started putting together since his experience in the United States and in the United Kingdom. He's now pushing for African unity, because Nkrumah realizes that independence was only the beginning, was opening of the door. But he also realized that independence presented a danger to individual, isolated, balkanized African countries. He realized they would not be able to protect their sovereignty, their independence, and their resources. Nkrumah was a student of history. He'd already seen what happened with Arbenz in Guatemala, deposed by the CIA coup, what happened to Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, deposed by the CIA coup at the behest of British Petroleum. So Nkrumah realized that he could experience the same fate, because he knew his own politics and he knew the vision that he had for Ghana. So when African leaders met in Addis Ababa in 1963 to form what became the Organization of African Unity, Nkrumah in his speech said, by the time we leave this conference, we should have a framework for a Pan-African government, for the United States of Africa, and delegate to our individual foreign ministers the task of drawing up the blueprint of how we could put this together. He said, we must unite or perish. At the end of the day, Africa did not unite, and that was the fate of Kwame Nkrumah. He perished, of course, like many other African leaders as well. He was not killed, not directly, but he was deposed in 1966. Before he was deposed, he did manage to accomplish one mission, major mission, which was the building of the Volta River Dam. Because Nkrumah wanted Ghana to use its natural resources to industrialize, and wanted African countries, all other African countries, to pursue the same strategy. He said the only reason why we continue to become much more impoverished, or what Walter Rodney or Samir Amin would refer to as dependent underdevelopment, is because we are designated as producers of raw commodities, which we then sell to the industrialized countries at a price dictated by the industrialized countries. And then we buy the products that they manufacture in their factories using our resources at the price that they then set for us. It's impossible to develop that way. We have to use our resources to build factories and to manufacture products in Africa. So that's why building the huge hydroelectric energy dam became his main passion in Ghana, in addition to African unity, of course. So he needed financing. And Britain initially committed to provide financing. But then in 1956, toward the end of 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt when Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal. And Eisenhower essentially said, no, I'm not backing you. And in humiliation, these aggressors had to withdraw. And then Britain and the whole world realized that Britain was no longer a superpower. And Britain could not afford to finance this project in Ghana. So Nkrumah sought financing from elsewhere. The United States supported financing this project. And according to a memo written by Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, it was a good project for the United States to finance, because then the so-called foreign aid would give the United States leverage over Kwame Nkrumah. So the World Bank also provided financing, and the project was built by Kaiser Alumina, an American company. And Kaiser did not want to build an integrated process in Ghana, where the bauxite would be used originating from Ghana and then used at the factory to produce the aluminum products, an integrated process. And then Ghana would be a net exporter. So Kaiser made sure that the aluminum, the bauxite for the aluminum, was sourced from outside Ghana, because they did not want Ghana to have that absolute control, fearing that Ghana, at some point when the project was profitable, would nationalize it. And that's why they deliberately kept the processes isolated in different countries. So that was the arrangement. Nkrumah did manage to complete that project in 1966. He inaugurated that project in January 1966. 1 month later, he was overthrown by the military, the Ghanaian military, who had been working with the Central Intelligence Agency to get rid of Nkrumah. This was during the Cold War era as well, when the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence in Africa. It had already led to the brutal murder of Patrice Lumumba in Congo. And now in 1966, Nkrumah suffered a similar fate. He was in China. He was in the process of being involved in negotiations as a mediator to end the Vietnam War. He never returned to Ghana. He was overthrown, and he lived in exile in Guinea at the time under President Sékou Touré, who was also a Pan-African. And we will look at him in our subsequent podcast. So there ended Nkrumah's dream for African unity. And he turned out to be so right. And he predicted, he said, if we did not unite now, this is in 1963, when the OAU was formed, it would become much more difficult in the future when the individual presidents become used to living in the presidential mansions, to singing their own individual national anthems and having their national flags on all the symbols of state, all the symbols of fake sovereignty, sovereignties that cannot be defended. I would like to offer some suggestions for, in terms of readings. I can offer Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism by Kwame Nkrumah. Notes for an African World Revolution by John Hendrik Clark. Hendrik is Henrik, and then Clark, Clarke. And then a documentary by the BBC, Black Power, the Kwame Nkrumah documentary, BBC, 1992. It is an interesting documentary. It offers useful and insightful information. Toward the end, it's a bit